Starting us off in at number 10, we have Danny.
I served a total of 40 years, a combination between 2 sentences, federal and state.
He was sentenced to prison for assault with attempt to murder, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, and that was just for his first sentencing. He served 24 years for that. The sentence began back in 1977, and he was sent to one of the most dangerous prisons in the country. It was a level 6 supermax facility. I mean, you had to have done some pretty horrible things to get yourself landed there. He spent 10 years at the supermax in segregation, and that was out of the 24 years, probably because he was deemed as very dangerous and had to be isolated from the general population in the prison. And the second sentencing, he was charged for a shooting. The state dropped the charges, but the feds became involved and they prosecuted him. Danny served 16 years on that charge, which brings him to a total of 40 years in prison. Well, after all of that, Danny was finally released.
The first one begins with the state prison, Walpole State Prison. I served 24 years out of a sentence, 31 to 35 years for armed assault with intent to murder, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon.
Coming in number 9, we have Thomas Trantino. When we get into these stories of people who spend a long time behind bars, there's usually one common factor: being born into a bad situation. Many of these people were indoctrinated into a life of crime before they were even old enough to vote. Thomas Trantino was already using drugs and had been to jail by the time he was 14 years old. Throughout his 20s, he got involved with gangs and continued to use drugs. Then in 1963, everything caught up with him when the police found him with drugs on his person, and it would seem like he was going to go to prison. He wanted to make a run for it, and things got violent, and he ended up killing 2 police officers. After this, he was on the run for almost 3 days. Once he was arrested, it didn't take long for him to be prosecuted, and he was supposed to get the death penalty. But then that all shifted when New Jersey took away the death penalty, so he was in prison for 38 years. In this time, he learned how to be an author. And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Coming in number 8, we have Harvey Stewart. This guy lived a pretty wild life. He was involved in crime from a very early age. He would organize backyard fights, was involved in the drug trade, and even committed murder. Eventually everything caught up with him and he was sentenced to prison. He was given a 60-year prison sentence and would see it all the way through. He talked about how his world got turned upside down when he was released. He was in prison before the computer was ever even a thing. One of the biggest events that happened at the time of his incarceration was the moon landing. It would be a tough adjustment for him to come back to the outside world. Coming in number 7, we have Paul Goodell Jr. I don't know if they have some sort of calculator to figure out how long a person should be put in prison to fix their problems, but for Paul Goodell Jr., he would get one of the longest sentences that anyone has ever lived out. It was back in the year 1911. He would be convicted for second-degree murder. Now everything would be put in place to see how long he would spend in jail, and it was an insane amount of time. At 17 years old, he would be sentenced to 68 years in prison, and he would live out his entire sentencing. He would walk out of the prison at 86 years old. I feel like at this point it would make more sense to let the person stay in prison if they wanted to. That would be their home for pretty much their whole life. What do you do when you have been in there for so long and then you finally get out and the world has morphed around you? Coming in at number 6, we have Otis Johnson. Otis served 44 years behind bars. The crime that he was convicted for was apparently trying to kill a police officer. He had his whole life ahead of him when he committed this crime, which makes you wonder why he would do such a thing. He was only 25 years old when he was convicted. One of the most interesting parts of this story was that he was arrested in the 70s, and he gave a breakdown of how the world has changed so much while he was locked up. He talked about how he didn't know how to use so much of the technology that we have available, and he lost contact with his family when he was behind bars. This meant he was basically thrown into an alien world and had nowhere to go. All that the prison gave him upon his release was $40 and 2 bus tickets. He didn't know where to go and had no money. Not to mention he was in his 60s and a convicted felon, so finding work would have been next to impossible. This left him homeless for a long time after he stepped out of prison. Coming in at number 5, we have Richard Honeck. Prison is a rough place now, but it used to be so much more horrible. So I can only imagine how this man was able to survive for so long behind bars. Richard Honeck was in prison in 1899, and it wasn't for no reason. He actually killed one of his childhood friends. I guess the two of them were never that close. He would go on to serve one of the longest prison sentences imaginable, 64 years. This made him 84 years old when he was eventually released from prison. After he was out, he actually lived well into his 90s before he passed away. I wonder what life he enjoyed more, being on the outside and free, or being locked up and having most of your life decided for you. Coming in at number 4, we have Johnson Van Dyke Grimsby. When you're in a card game with some of your buddies, things can get a little heated. I mean, it doesn't even need to be a card game, it can just be a game of Monopoly. You get too into that and things will start to get squirrely really fast. Well, John Grimsby was alive well before anyone was playing Monopoly, so it would be a little bit of poker that would set him off. While deep into a game of poker, he got into a disagreement with some of the people and he ended up killing one of them. Once the police caught up with him, he was behind bars very quickly. He tried to get his case overturned, but every time he got the same result of being convicted for second-degree murder. But that didn't stop him from trying to get his case viewed under a new light. He made a total of 33 attempts at having his case appealed, and I understand why. He had a long time to work on the process. Grimsby was locked up for a total of 66 years. Eventually, he lived out his prison sentence and was let go. At this point, he was 90 years old, and he was taken straight to a nursing home. And what happened next might be the craziest part of the whole story. After only a few years in a nursing home, he opted out and wanted to be put back in prison, either because he was so used to the system that it had become his life for so long, or because nursing homes are a terrible place to be. Coming in at number 3, we have Richard Lima. Richard Lima was only 19 years old when him and a buddy would commit a crime that would change his life forever. It was in the mid-80s and the two of them walked into a series of stores and robbed them all at gunpoint. They didn't do a good enough job to cover the tracks and the two of them were arrested pretty quickly. Once everything was said and done, Lima was looking at 98 years behind bars, but he was about to get the luckiest break of his life. They screwed up his paperwork and he was actually able to serve his sentences consecutively, so he was released from prison in 2003. Coming in number 2, we have Ricky Jackson. Not every time someone gets locked up does it lead to justice. Sometimes it's actually the exact opposite. Ricky Jackson and one of his friends would find themselves in court on the charge of murder when they were both only 19 years old. This was back in the 1970s, and Ricky and his friend were both black, so the courts were leaning against them hard. There was pretty much no evidence in the case that linked these two men to the murder except for one witness who said they saw them at the scene of the crime. That was all it took to have these men locked up for 39 years. It wasn't until that point when this witness came forward when the case was reopened and he told the truth, that he never saw them that day. See, the witness was only 13 years old at the time of the trial. The police coerced him to lying and sending these two innocent men to prison. On the bright side, both of these men should be awarded $18 million by the state for taking the best years of their life away from them. I don't know if there's any amount of money you could pay me to spend 40 years in prison though. Coming in at number 1, we have John Franzese. This man was a high-ranking member of the Colombo crime family. He spent 50 years behind bars, and when you hear what he did, you might be surprised they ever let him out. Franzese claims that while he was working as an underboss for one of the largest crime families in America, he killed somewhere around 60 people. What the hell? This dude is out there murdering people like it's nothing, and there are other people who did nothing wrong, and they both could have ended up in the same prison. That is terrifying. Well, I don't think anyone thought John Franzese would live to see the light of day outside of prison again, but he actually made it to the ripe age of 100. And even though this is a tired old man, I wouldn't want to be in a room alone with him. I wouldn't be surprised if he still had the moves to take me out.
Alright, number 10, we have Eddie Collins, who spent 43 years in prison after the Justice Project became involved, and after 12 years, they were able to prove that Eddie Collins was actually innocent. Is this real life right now? Oh, and a side note for you guys, is this real life right now? Shirts is coming very soon, and I'm gonna be giving out free ones to you guys. Alright, getting back into this, sorry, I got totally excited there. Well, going back to this, it took 43 years to prove that the justice system locked up the wrong person. Collins was convicted of first-degree murder, but it was actually his brother that committed the murder. But in 1973, his brother took a plea deal that only landed himself 10 years in prison, and he confessed that he didn't do it, Eddie did it, it was his brother, he was the shooter. Eddie was just 21 years old, and his younger brother Johnny was just 17 years old at the time. It was a drug deal that went wrong. I guess with Johnny being a minor, the justice system allowed him to take a plea deal in exchange for him to say it was his brother. So his brother was convicted for the next 43 years. The longest serving prisoner in the United Kingdom at the time, well, he was just released last year. He's up next. Number 9, we have a 93-year-old man who spent the past 35 years in prison for angrily killing his wife and brother-in-law. This man had no idea he'd be able to actually outlive his prison sentence. He was almost 60 years old when he was sentenced for life for a double murder. Now that he's out of jail, he's trying to teach people how to hold back your anger because he wasn't able to, and it led him to murdering 2 people.
Jailed in 1980 at age 58 when he could not control his anger and ended up killing his wife and his brother-in-law.
When he was released from prison, he talked about what happened.
Very angry. We tried settling the issue, but that did not work. My brother-in-law worsened the problem when he gave my wife to another man at a time we had not divorced. If we had even separated, it would have been better than just giving my wife to another man. All these got me very angry and I killed.
Number 8, we have Ricky Jackson, who was actually wrongfully convicted of murder, and he spent 40 years behind bars. This one is absolutely insane. He was able to outlive his sentencing and became a free man at the age of 56 years old, which means if the math is done correctly, he was only 16 years old when he was convicted. Is this real life right now?
You know, words can't express how I feel right now. I'm just glad to be out, glad to be a free man.
What are you going to do? Where are you going to go?
Wow. I mean, you know, you sit in prison for so long, you think about this day, but when it actually comes, you don't know what you just want to do something, you know, besides what you've been doing for 39 years.
I think that's so sad. I would be super upset if I went to prison for 40 years for absolutely nothing.
What are your thoughts about the people who got you here in the first place 39 years ago? The people who said you did it when you didn't?
Well, I guess a lot of people will want me to hate that person and carry animosity towards him, but I don't.
Jackson was put away to prison based on a testimony. Okay, get this. A testimony of a 12-year-old boy who has now admitted he lied. Well, obviously it sucks because it took 40 years for the truth to come out, but luckily Jackson was able to outlive his prison sentence and was able to live as a free man. Let's move on to number 7 on this list. We have Craig COLEY, who was able to outlive his prison sentence when he walked out the front doors of the correctional facility at the age of 71 years old. Well, his story is pretty sad because he was behind bars for 38 years for a crime just like the other guy we just talked about, for a crime he did not commit.
COLEY was granted a full pardon by Governor Jerry Brown, citing new DNA evidence clearing COLEY, but also mishandling by the investigators who originally were on his case, even implying the possibility he was framed.
Absolutely insane. What is going on? It's so crazy to think that maybe law enforcement framed this guy in this particular case. He did win a settlement for $21 million. I don't think any amount of money can bring back what COLEY has lost. He was in his early 30s when he was incarcerated. I mean, at this time, for the majority of it, people are having kids or getting into their careers. This is a pretty valuable part of any person's life. I've not even reached 38 years old. I mean, I'm not even 30 yet. And I can't imagine my whole life, the whole life that I've spent living already, just in prison. And I can't even start to understand what COLEY went through.
Incredible story, but hard to imagine. Wrongly convicted for 38 years.
Every time I see one of those stories, I'm equal parts angry and sad. You know?
I think you are not alone. Yeah, well, glad he's home for this Thanksgiving.
Number 6, a man who was released from prison at the age of 95 years old, but actually isn't the oldest prisoner on this list. You guys are gonna have to wait till the end of this video. Well, number 2 has the oldest person on this list. It's a crazy story. You're gonna wanna keep watching. We're talking about a mob boss named John Sonny Finizzi.
And John got sentenced to 50 years, and he did every minute of every hour of every day of every year of that sentence.
Finizzi was a very powerful Italian-American mobster who was a long member of the Colombo crime family. His career in organized crime spans for 9 decades. I don't even know how that's possible, but it started when he was 16 years old. He's still alive today and is currently 102 years old. Well, Finizzi's son actually testified against him in court.
Obviously, he had nothing to do with this. He wasn't involved with bank robbers. He didn't know these people. Prior to trial, he took 2 polygraph tests that he passed. You know, in the real world, it should have been the end of the case or whatever.
Next up, number 5.
My name is William Earl Bassett. I did 50 years, 3 months, and 3 days in Stateville. Menard, you see.
Is this real life right now? William Earl Bassett spent over 50 years in prison, and he was even on death row.
About 5 or 6 years. When I first got off of death row, they put me on there. They were scared to put me in population.
The prison was afraid to put Bassett back into general population, and that was because he was deemed too dangerous. Well, after he was released, he was given $18 to go on the train to go to somewhere. Bassett had no idea what to do. He has no family members, friends, or knowledge on how this new world works. Number 4, let's actually talk about a very famous, iconic person, a man who served 27 years in prison, a man who fought for his freedom. Well, he outlived his sentence and then became a president. You guys know who I'm talking about, right?
One of the things that is difficult for me to comprehend is that we spent such a long time here.
Okay, yeah, you guys are smart. You guys guessed this one. We're talking about Nelson Mandela, one of the most recognized, iconic figures in history. His life is just so fascinating to me. He was sentenced to prison for 27 years, and that was because he was conspiring to overthrow the state. He didn't believe in what they were doing, or what they believed in. He was a very controversial figure, a figure that was able to outlive a very long prison sentence, and when he came out, it took him just 4 years, I think it was like under 4 years, to become the president of South Africa. He served from 94 to 1999. Mandela was the first ever black person who was the head of state and the first elected in a fully representative democratic election. He left behind such an insane legacy, and I couldn't not put him on this list because I'm so damn glad he was able to outlive that outrageous prison sentence and was able to do amazing things. Number 3, we have Harvey Stewart, who outlived his 60-year prison sentence. 60 years before he was arrested, the price of gasoline was 20 cents a gallon. Harry Truman was the president. President Donald Trump was only 13 years old. Stewart was a convicted killer who was released from prison at the age of 83 years old. I'm pretty sure he's way too old now to really put society in any type of danger. Stewart was the longest serving inmate among 155,000 prisoners in the Texas system. I'm pretty sure that's a record you don't want to be known for. He was released from prison and was put into a nursing home. In the nursing home, he has been looking into his case. So why is he looking into his case? Well, Stewart is trying to actually have his case reopened because for the past 6 decades, he's been saying he is innocent. A crazy life that guy has lived, and we may not ever know if he actually committed the murder he was convicted of or not. Number 2, like I actually told you guys, this guy's pretty old. Well, I couldn't 100% confirm this story, but apparently Henry William Bourne was sentenced to prison for 99 years, and yes, he outlived it. Back in the 20s, he was convicted of stealing horses, and I guess that was worse than committing a murder back then, because how the heck do you steal a horse and get sentenced to 99 years in prison? Well, apparently he stole over 7,000 horses and mules, so I guess that's why. That's what gets you 99 years in prison. Well, 1,700 of those horses were supposed to go to the American military, and this was during the First World War, so maybe that's the reason why he got the long sentencing, because everyone's fighting in battle without horses now. He stole those horses along with 8 other men who were sentenced to death. Is this real life right now? The 20s were so damn harsh. People got the death sentence for stealing horses. Well, Bourne wasn't sentenced to death because he was actually underage. Well, he outlived his sentence and he was released at the age of 117 years old. How the heck does a man live that long while being in the system? There doesn't seem to be any medical care or dentists, and there's no real way to keep healthy in prison. It's just from what I'm reading, not from experience or anything. Finally, number 1, we have a man who has served almost 60 years in prison. John F. Kennedy was the US president when Sheldon Top was sentenced to prison for murdering a man. He was given the automatic life sentence without the chance of parole. He was just 17 years old when the crime was committed, and he was released at the age of 74 years old. He grew up in prison and he doesn't know any other life.
Feels good. Feels good.
I think it's so sad that this guy went into prison as a young teenager and he walked out of there with a walker. It's pretty emotional, but I guess we have to remember that this guy, a lot of these people on this list, they've killed someone, so they need to pay the price. Starting off at number 10, we have Eddie Collins, and this is not to get confused with Eddie Collins, the American baseball player. We're talking about a man who's been locked up for the past 43 years. Eddie was serving time for first-degree murder. Throughout his prison stay, he said, and I quote, quote, "It was a sad situation. It was something I regret and still regret." He was 21 years old, living in Arizona at the time he was locked up. He grew up in the bad part of the city where he was buying drugs with his 17-year-old brother. Well, one day when Eddie and his brother was buying drugs, they got into an altercation, and that's when Eddie pulled out a gun, and you guys know what happens next. Bam bam, life in jail. At number 9, we're talking about John Massey, who spent 43 years behind bars and was finally released at the age of 69 years old. He was handed a mandatory 20-year life sentence, but he spent more than double that time. During his time in prison, his mother was dying and he asked if he can go see her on her deathbed, but he was denied compassionate leave. Well, after 43 years, he was released from prison as an innocent person. I hate that this is a very common trend. It's just so heartbreaking hearing how much time these convicts spend behind bars for crimes they did not commit. I really don't feel bad for people who are behind bars for a very, very long time. You know, the ones that actually commit horrible crimes. Number 8, we have Richard Phillips, who spent 45 years in prison, and again, going with the trend on this one, he was innocent.
There is no price to put on freedom. That's yours. That's something that you were born with. And you're supposed to be able to continue to be free until the day you die without anybody or any entity or any state coming in there taking your life away from you. They don't have the right to do that.
Well, Phillips' rights were taken away from him when he was convicted back in 1972 for a murder he didn't commit. When he was released from prison at the time, he was the longest serving wrongfully convicted prisoner in US history. Phillips was paid $1.5 million from the Michigan Wrongful Imprisonment Compensation Act funds. There was a law that passed that dictates that exonerated ex-inmates be paid $50,000 for each year spent in prison who were innocent. I think that is total BS. I would fight for $1 million for every single year that I had to spend behind bars as an innocent person, because you know what? At the end of the day, you can't even pay me $1 million to go to prison fearing for my life every single day for a year. $1 million just ain't worth it for me. This man would have received $45 million. I've seen people win millions of dollars for way dumber lawsuits. Moving into number 7, we have Sheldry Top, who served 57 years in prison. It's so crazy to think that we have someone who have served 57 years in prison, and we're only at number 7. As we go on this list, the prison time gets longer and longer. Sheldry Top was finally released from prison when he was 74 years old. I'm a brown guy, I did the math. It means he was in prison when he was 17 years old, and he was convicted for murder. Do you guys think it's fair for a 17-year-old to be sentenced to 57 years behind bars? In this case, we do believe the justice system did get it right. This was the right person who committed the crime, and on his way out of prison, he addressed the murder. I mean, he wasn't denying it.
Out of respect for the Davis family, I have no comment at this time.
So Sheldry walked into prison as a young teen with a whole future ahead of him, and now he slowly walks out with a walker with not much ahead of him. Must be hard for the family seeing this man walk free, and the person he killed will never have the same opportunity. Up next, we have Harvey Stewart, who served 60 years in prison. He comes in on our list at number 6. Stewart served 60 years behind bars. When he walked out, he was 83 years old. He was Texas's longest serving inmate. When Stewart went to prison for murder, Harry Truman was the president. This was from 1945 to 1953. World War II just ended. The average salary was $956. A new car was about $800. And gas was 18 cents. Life was pretty damn good. So coming out of prison for Harvey Stewart, it was much different. Making his 18 cents in prison wasn't gonna cut it for him in the real world. And you know what? Most convicts on this list, or just in general, most convicts who have spent so much time in prison are not able to adapt to the real outside world. I've read so many inmates who actually ask to stay in prison because they don't know of any other world, or quickly just commit another crime so they can be sent back home. Number 5, we have Richard Honeck, who served 63 years behind bars. He was a telegraph operator and a son of a wealthy dealer in farm equipment. Well, this was back in 1899. By the way, hence being a telegraph operator. I mean, what the heck is that these days? Well, Honeck was 20 years old when he was arrested in Chicago for a murder. Honeck was a very, very bad person. He stabbed the assistant warden with a handcrafted knife. He served 20 days in confinement for that infraction, and he was shackled with a ball and chain for 6 months. Again, shackled with a ball and chain, this was a long time ago. After those incidents, he kept clean, worked in the prison bakery for 35 years. There was huge media attention when he was released from prison at the age of 84 years old. He was released into a nursing home where he was able to live another 13 years before passing away at the age of 97 years old. Moving into number 4, we have a very interesting man who made no sense, well, at least not to me. We're talking about Bill Wallace. He was locked up in J Ward prison, which was for the criminally insane. It housed many famous people. Back in 1926, Wallace was suspected of murdering a man in a cafe in Melbourne, Australia. A policeman was nearby the scene and he was able to arrest Wallace, who was the suspect at the time. When he was taken in for questioning, he refused to answer any questions or talk about the crime. There was no witnesses and no admission to the crime, and Wallace was found unfit to plead to the crime as he was declared insane by 2 different doctors. He was sentenced away at J Ward prison at the governor's pleasure, which means the governor can feel like if Wallace has been cured or is able to live in society again, he can just let him go. Like there was no sentencing on this man. Was he there for a day? Was he there for 10 years? Well, all Wallace had to do was talk and work with the doctors, but he refused to talk with the doctors, so he became institutionalized for the next 64 years. Once he reached 100 years in prison, the word got around and there was a petition to release him, so with all of the pressure, he was released shortly after. But again, to remind you guys, he was never sentenced for a length of time. He lived just 1 month shy of his 108th birthday. Number 3, we have Howard Christensen, who served 64 years in prison. Unfortunately, he was sentenced to spend the majority of his life behind bars when he was only 16 years old. So what crime did he commit to deserve this cruel punishment? Well, when he was hitchhiking with one of his friends, they killed the teacher while robbing her. So yeah, I'd say this sentence was pretty much justified. But you guys tell me. You guys be the judge on this one. The judge originally sentenced him to life without parole, but it was later changed to 200 years. The other kid ended up hanging himself in prison several years later. I guess he couldn't deal with the guilt, or he didn't want to spend the rest of his life looking at metal bars. While Christensen was in prison, he was a difficult inmate. He was usually punished with shock therapy for his bad behavior, and he even had a frontal lobotomy done. I mean, ouch, but in 1995, the warden wanted to release him after spending years in prison and mental institutions. They had a hard time finding a place for him, so he was actually released in 2001 and he passed away in 2003. So in reality, he only experienced 18 years as a free man. At number 2, we have Charles Ford. He spent 64 years behind bars for an assault. This was a crime he didn't do, and it took 64 years with the help of technology to prove that. He was only 20 years old at the time he was convicted, and he walked out of prison in his 80s. He was released from prison into a nursing home. He probably got so old he had no idea what was going on. Also, what if you had dementia in prison and you're innocent, and you can no longer fight for your own justice because you don't know what anything is anymore? Very flawed, and it's sad hearing about all these, these many stories we've been talking about. Ford was the longest serving inmate in Maryland. He is a black man who was convicted by an all-white jury members in a time where racism was a very big thing. One of the victims actually identified a different man as her attacker, but the judge argued, saying that both men looked, alike enough. It was enough alike. Ford at the time was the only person present at the first conviction, so he was tried and he was just convicted because there was nobody else. And now coming in number 1, we have John Phillips, the man who spent 66 years of his life in prison. Back in 1952, Phillips has been behind bars, and this is after he was arrested on sexual assault charges. He was only 18 years old at the time and was only in the 9th grade. He has failed many times, it seems like. Phillips was evaluated by doctors and they determined that he has the mind of a 7-year-old. And during the hearing, his lawyers took a plea deal that got him locked up for the past 66 years. He was able to outlive his prison sentence at the age of 85 years old. Phillips has been clean and out of trouble for the past 29 years. He committed no disciplinary infractions. Although Phillips pleaded guilty to the crime, there is a chance he didn't commit any crimes, which is just so messed up. And now with the loss of medical and court records, it's virtually impossible to do any DNA tests or to even reopen the case. But I suppose at this point, I mean, this man has already served almost 7 decades behind bars. To use a get out of jail card at number 10, we're starting off with a wild story about Lima Marin, who was sentenced to 98 years in prison back in 1998 for a robbery while using a gun. The gun was actually not loaded and no one was hurt, but for some reason he was sentenced harshly to 98 years in prison. Lima was 19 years old at the time. Well, it was a shock when after just 10 years in 2008, Lima was released from prison. 6 years after being released, a former prosecutor realized that Lima was released from prison by mistake. So he was sent back where he was sentenced, he was resentenced. During the time he was out of jail, Lima was able to turn his life around. He got a job, he even got married. Lima has been in prison ever since that incident, and this has become a really high profile case, and it leaves us with a lot of questions. Well, this guy has now served a total of 19 years. He served his time. He didn't hurt anyone. He didn't even have bullets in his gun. There was no intent there. And when he was released, he showed that he has changed his life around, so why keep him in prison? What do you guys think about this whole thing? The public is now behind this man, so he's probably going to be released very, very soon. Moving into number 9, we're talking about Otis Johnson, who just served 44 years behind bars. Otis went to prison at the age of 25 years old for attempted murder of a police officer. Otis has been locked away since the 70s, and now he's just entered into the modern society of complex technology. It's going to be a really tough time for him, but he did commit a horrible crime. Back in 1998 was when he lost touch with his family, so he doesn't know anything about them or where they are. He's just alone in the world. When he was released from prison, they gave him his ID back and they gave him $40. Here you go, spending spree. He is for sure gonna have to renew his ID because I mean he's been locked away for a very long time, and $40 won't actually get you that far. And oh yeah, he also got 2 bus tickets. I mean, where the heck is Otis gonna go? He enters the world as a homeless person. He was released at the age of 69 years old. Most of your life is gone. You've like lived it and it was in jail. You can no longer work, so I'm not sure how he's gonna make a living. Well, I guess that was a decision he should have decided 44 years ago. Number 8, we have John Franzese, who is a 100-year-old mobster who was just released from prison after serving 50 years behind bars. John was released on the 23rd of June of this year, so that was just like weeks ago. He was released from the Federal Medical Center. John was an underboss of the crime organization. John has boasted about killing at least 60 people in his lifetime of crime. It's actually so crazy to me that this guy was allowed to be released into the public. I know he's probably now a very, very harmless old man who can't really do anything, but he didn't give those 60 people a chance at life. I don't know, I'm just saying. Serving 60 years at number 7, we have Harvey Stewart. Harvey was released back in 2011 at the age of 83 years old. Harvey Stewart has a really long rap sheet, from a junkyard heist in Houston to murdering someone. During most of his prison stay, not many people visited him, and Stewart can't recall one person who visited him in the past decade or 2. He has been isolated from the world and doesn't know what's been going on. He doesn't know the Paul brothers are taking over YouTube. So coming out after 60 years must be a huge shock to him, especially this. Like, what is that? How do you explain that that was the most popular thing this year? When he was sentenced to prison, a Volkswagen Beetle cost just $1,700. Shoes were $10. John F. Kennedy was president. People went to space for the first time. The Beatles just released their first single in the UK. So much has changed over time. Number 6, we have a man who served 62 years behind bars. We're talking about Hugh Alderman. He was a bank robber who was obviously caught. His jail sentence started when he was 23 years old back in 1917. Hugh was the sole survivor of a 4-man gang. Just a few years after being sent to prison, he was able to escape, and he escaped again in 1924. In 1927, he was released to a mental hospital where he passed away at the age of 86 years old. Hugh lost his whole life just because he wanted some money. He didn't want to work for it. He was able to steal $6,000, which is like, what the heck? But back then, that's $6,000 back then. With inflation, the money now would be worth around $124,000. That's still not enough money to just lose your whole life, like to take chance of that. I don't know. Now, this person has lived a really sad story, and this person comes in at number 5. And I'm talking about Charles Edret Ford, who outlived a 64-year-long prison sentence. The sad part is Charles was innocent. He has served one of the longest sentences as an innocent person. He was actually released from prison just last year. Charles was convicted of murder. Well, here's a little backstory. This took place in the early 50s, and Charles is a black man who appeared in front of an all-white juror in a time where black people didn't have any rights. Charles was just 20 years old at the time, and his life just flashed before him. After 64 years, he was finally released in a nursing center where he's now 86 years old. I mean, this is a really sad situation. There's no way to give him his life back. Howard Christensen is next up on this list at number 4. Howard was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of a teacher in 1937. He was 16 years old at the time when he murdered a teacher. He committed this crime alongside a 17-year-old who was also caught for the crime. That person was also sentenced to life in prison, but they hung themselves back in 1943, just 6 years after being sentenced. About 30 years into the prison sentence, the sentence was changed from life without parole to 200 years in prison. But in 2001, after serving 64 years, he was released from prison, but just 2 years after that, he passed away. Number 3, Richard Honeck. At the age of 22 years old, Richard was sentenced to life in prison for murder of a former school friend. Life in prison sentence usually varies depending on where you live in the world. It can depend on what state you live in or what city you live in. I know this state has very different laws. Some places they even have a 3-strike law, meaning no matter what crime you commit, if it's 3 crimes, you're sentenced to life. So for Richard, he was paroled after serving 63 years and 1 month in jail. He was released at the age of 85 years old. He lived out another 12 years until he passed away at the age of 97 years old, and that was back in 1976. Now at number 2, we have Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby. Johnson was sentenced to prison back in 1908 for murder. Over the years, he was denied parole 33 times before he was finally released at the age of 89 years old because he was deemed not a threat to anyone anymore. He wasn't a threat to society, so let's just release him. He was released in 1974 after serving 66 years, but he actually quickly returned back to prison voluntarily after finding it too difficult to find a job. So he checked himself back into prison for 2 more years. So now at the age of 91 years old, he's finally out of prison for good. And then 10 years after that, at the age of 101 years old, he passed away. I mean, that's a really sad situation when you check yourself back into prison because you don't know any other life. Finally, at number 1, we have Paul Goodell Jr., who is known to have served the longest prison sentence in the United States, possibly the world. He was sentenced to 68 years in a variety of different New York State prisons, and he actually lived to see the day when he was released from prison. That is actually a very rare thing. At the end of his lengthy sentence, he was paroled at the age of 86 years old. Back in 1911, Paul was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 17 years old. When Paul was paroled, he actually didn't want to leave prison because that was the only life that he knew. But at the end, he decided to leave. So when he left, there was a lot of reporters there, but he said he doesn't want any publicity. He doesn't want to be on the news. He doesn't even care if people know who he is. Paul went on to live in a nursing home before dying at the age of 93 years old, which is about 7 years after being released from prison. This guy only spent about 24 years of his entire life as a free man. Okay, so starting us off, number 10, we have Desmond Ricks, who has just spent 25 years behind bars. U.S. prosecutors just dropped all the charges for Desmond because after this case was looked into again recently, investigators found out that the police falsified evidence. Desmond was convicted of gunning down a friend outside a restaurant in Detroit, Michigan back in 1992, and he was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Is this real life right now? So Desmond went to jail because people thought he killed his friend, so for 25 years, everyone probably believed that he did it. So for that long, this guy just sat in a jail cell thinking about why he's even there. Desmond was released at the age of 51 years old, and it's going to be hard for him to go back into society, but you know what, he does have a little bit of help. In a new Michigan law, it awards wrongly convicted prisoners $50,000 each year spent in prison, which means he would be eligible for $1.25 million. Number 9, we have Eddie Bolden, and he's from Chicago. He's served 22 years behind bars for a double murder charge. Back in 1994, Eddie was convicted based on the testimony of a single eyewitness. Something doesn't seem right there. There were 3 other people who actually placed him at a different location at the time of the murders, but those witnesses never testified. Eddie spent the next few decades in the prison's law library studying his case because he knows he is innocent. His family believed his innocence as well. When Eddie went to prison, he left behind a family and his 1-year-old son. It took 22 years in prison for him to finally be innocent of the crime he was wrongfully convicted of. Eddie's life was just stripped. Eddie kept fighting hard, and he was able to outlive his sentence and prove his innocence. The police should now be worried about a murderer who's been on the loose for the past 22 years. Coming out of prison at number 8, we have Kevin Charles Siehl, who served 25 years behind bars. Kevin was convicted of killing his wife back in 1991. She was found stabbed to death in her apartment. She was stabbed more than 20 times and was left in a bathtub with the water running in an effort effort to wash away the evidence. Kevin was the prime suspect and he was arrested and he was charged, but he has always maintained his innocence and gone as far as to file numerous appeals since his convictions. Kevin was convicted based off of blood that was found on his personal items in the bathroom, and even on his right shoe there was blood found as well. Well, his right shoe was finally tested and it appeared the blood on the shoe was actually his own. Kevin is now in his 60s and he was granted a motion from the state attorney general's office to reopen the case, and the case was quickly overturned. The general's office chosen to abandon the case and ordered his release. He now has the opportunity to live out the rest of his life as normal as he can in society. Two of Kevin's brothers were in the courtroom when he was released. They were brought to tears. It wasn't proven that Kevin was the killer, but this case just seemed to be dropped. Maybe there was too much legal fees, or maybe there was too much embarrassment for the lack of investigation into this case. Moving into number 7, we have Clarence Moses, who was a Colorado man who was convicted of rape back in 1987. He was convicted of raping his neighbor. Clarence was sentenced to 48 years behind bars, but he only served 28 years. Now this is where the story gets really crazy. Back during the trial, the victim told the police that she has been drinking with neighbors before she returned home, and that was the moment where she was brutally raped twice. When police initially asked her who the attacker was, she actually named 3 different men on who it could be. It could be A, B, or C. The next day, she claimed to have a dream of who the victim was. She went to the police. She says it was this guy, Clarence Moses. He was the attacker. And that was the day Clarence's life changed forever. Over the next years, he maintained his innocence, and Clarence tried to appeal his conviction, but it was unsuccessful. However, in the 90s, he won a legal bid for a DNA testing on the evidence to clear his name, but police actually mistakenly destroyed the evidence. I mean, is this real life right now? How do you accidentally destroy evidence? Because of the lost evidence, he wasn't released yet. Clarence's big break was actually years later, 2012, 28 years after he was sentenced. The actual victim wrote him a letter admitting he was actually the one who had sex with her that night. I mean, what a sick story. Why let a guy serve 28 years for your wrongdoing and then you write him a letter in prison much later? Now at number 6, we have Glenn, who was wrongfully convicted for murder, and he served 30 years because of it. So Glenn was released, and to say, sorry for the mistake, he was given a $30 gift card. I mean, is this real life right now? This is just so disrespectful. $30? Well, luckily under the Louisiana law, where he was in prison, he's actually entitled to a lot more. Well, $400,000 worth in compensation for the time he spent in solitary confinement at a notorious maximum security facility. This is still not enough money in my opinion. You should be entitled to millions of dollars, because for the past 30 years, this man was on death row with very limited privileges in prison. This story made big headline news, and Glenn was interviewed on 60 Minutes. Moving into number 5, we have Lawrence McKinney, who is from Tennessee. He was released from prison back in 2009 after DNA evidence ruled him out as a suspect. It's just too bad that they couldn't rule this out, 31 years ago when he was sentenced. This is absolutely insane. It took investigators, police officers, judges, jury members 31 years to figure out that Lawrence is an innocent man. Right now, Lawrence is fighting for an exoneration case that could grant him $1 million in compensation. So far, he's been denied twice. Lawrence was convicted of rape and burglary back in 1978, and he was sentenced to prison for 115 years. Just imagine that day when he was sentenced. I mean, an innocent person, and you just found out, you just been sentenced for 115 years. When Lawrence was finally released from jail, he was issued $75. I mean, what the heck is he gonna do with that? Hopefully he uses that money to make a ton of phone calls to the right people. A man who served 35 years in prison without a trial strangely comes into this list at number 4. It just doesn't make sense. We're talking about Jerry HartField, whose case was very extraordinary. When Jerry was released from prison, he was one of the most unlikely prisoners ever to be freed in Texas. Jerry wasn't exonerated, he wasn't even released on parole, he didn't even finish up his sentence because there really wasn't a sentence for this man. Let me explain. Texas actually just gave up on this case and allowed Jerry to be a free man, which makes absolutely no sense to me. When I was researching this, I took a deep dive onto this one. Jerry was waiting 35 years between trials without a conviction. He was simply just forgotten about in the system. This does happen, and I'm thinking I might make a top 10 video of like top 10 prisoners who were just forgotten about in prison for decades. Let me know if that's a good idea. Well, Jerry was put into prison because of a murder, but there was no evidence that like this was the guy. He was just sentenced to prison. He could have been the guy. The length of the prison stay wasn't announced. In fact, he was supposed to get a new trial in 1980 after an appeals court reversed his conviction and death sentence because of a flaw during the jury selection. But now he's out due to a fellow prisoner and a public defender who discovered a huge mistake 35 years later. Alright, just like that, number 3, we have a man who's been in prison for 41 years, and he becomes the first Detroit juvenile lifer to get a second life. This right here is William Washington, and back in 1975, when he was just 17 years old, he decided to rob a record store along with 26-year-old Kenneth Rooker. There was a scuffle with the store owner, and this resulted in the store owner being shot to death. Because of this, William received a life without parole sentence for first-degree murder, as well as a second life sentence for armed robbery. Well, 41 years later, he was given a second chance at life. Okay, I want to turn this question to you guys. Let me ask you, what do you guys think about juveniles who commit horrible crime? Should they have a second chance at life? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Number 2, just like number 3, we have another teen killer who has been released. This person was released in Spring Garden Township, which is located in Pennsylvania. We're talking about Scott Griffin, who was found guilty of first-degree murder for fatally shooting his ex-girlfriend, 17-year-old Linda Hagen. And this was back in 1974. Scott was only 16 years old at the time. Scott was serving a mandatory life sentence for the murder, but now he has been paroled. This actually makes him the first juvenile lifer from York County to be released from prison since a significant ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court. Back in 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that it is unconstitutional to impose automatic life sentences for those who commit crimes before turning 18 years old. So this is when Scott was released after 43 years behind bars. He was able to outlive his insane life sentence. Now he's in his 70s and there isn't much to life that he's able to do. And finally, at number 1, we have Joseph Ligon. Joseph has been behind bars since he was 16 years old back in the 60s. That's about 11 presidents ago. The first person has been to space. Joseph is 79 years old, which makes him the oldest living juvenile offender, and also he has served the longest sentence of any other juvenile offender. That's for sure a record that you don't want to beat. At 16 years old, Joseph took part in a murder of 2 men in Philadelphia. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Well, because the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision that deemed a mandatory life sentence for juvenile offenders unconstitutional, this means Joseph now has a chance to be released from prison anytime now. Well, actually, he was already given the chance to be placed on parole immediately, but he declined. The reason why is because he doesn't want to be paroled and just be placed on probation. He wants to serve out his time and just be released as a free man.
Coming in at number 10, we have Eddie Collins. The people you are going to see on today's list spent so much time in jail that they got shifted around so much that when they got out of jail, everything probably looked like an alien world. Eddie Collins spent 43 years in prison. He was only 21 years old when he would get locked up for murder. It was an unfortunate situation. Eddie and his brother were doing whatever they could to try and get by. They grew up in a poor neighborhood and there weren't a lot of options for either of them. It was really a dog-eat-dog world out there. Well, they turned to selling drugs to try and make some money. They would buy their goods off of a supplier and then move their product out to the streets to sell it. Well, one day things got heated in the exchange and Eddie had to pull out a gun to defend himself. He shot and killed the person who they were buying drugs off of, and it didn't take long for the cops to track him down. He was quickly arrested and sentenced to 43 years in prison. While he was locked up, he was interviewed and he said that he regretted what happened that day.
We have another innocent man at number 9, Keith Allen Harward. He was just released from prison after serving 33 years behind bars for a crime that he did not commit. He was wrongly convicted in 1982. Keith was convicted of murdering Jesse Perron and raping his wife in Virginia. Keith was released when he was 60 years old. The Innocence Project tweeted this out when he was released. After 33 years of wrongful conviction, hashtag Keith Howard is finally free. So this is a really sad part about this. Keith was able to outlive his prison sentence, but his parents were not able to, which means his parents passed away thinking that their son was a murderer, but he's innocent. Also, Keith was denied going to his parents' funeral. funeral. So now he wants someone to pay for this. What a sad, sad situation. Moving into number 8, we have Albert Woodfox, who served 43 years behind bars. Well, actually, Albert was America's longest standing solitary confinement prisoner. Albert had no view of the sky from his 6-foot by 9-foot concrete box, which is like way smaller than my bed, I think. And over that time, he has had no human contact. Anyone in this situation would go crazy. I would go crazy after just 1 hour. There are scientific studies that have shown that you can actually inflict severe psychological damage on an individual by putting them in solitary confinement for just a week. Albert's lawyer has been fighting this for decades. They have been saying that this is an extreme and cruel punishment. What do you guys think? If you murder someone, do you deserve to be in like a small cell for like 40 years, 50 years? Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comment section below. At number 7, we have Ricky Jackson, who served 40 years in prison. Ricky was convicted at the age of 18 years old for murder he did not commit. I mean, what is going on with this trend here? Why are all these people being sent to jail for a crime that they did not commit? Ricky was 58 years old when he was released, and that was just in 2015, so a couple years ago. There was a federal lawsuit against the city of Cleveland and the police officers who Ricky says helped frame him back in 1975. This wouldn't be the first case where police interfered with an investigation. We all know the Brendan Dassey case, you know, the kid from the Netflix original Making a Murderer. If you haven't watched that show, I honestly highly recommend it. It's really good. Ricky, when he was sentenced, he was actually given the death sentence, but later it was commuted to life in prison. This just makes you think on like how many innocent people there are out there who's been in prison for last like decades. And nowadays we have all these technologies that can avoid the mix-up, but there must be still thousands of people, innocent people, locked away due to the lack of technology back in the day. Number 6, we have a Guinness World Record holder, and we're talking about Aiwa Hakamada, who is a Japanese former professional boxer who was sentenced to death in 1968 for a mass murder that became known as the Hakamada incident. In 2011, he was awarded the Guinness World Record for the world's longest held death row inmate. Definitely a record you don't want to try to go for. In 2014, after being on death row for 46 years, he was released. The trial came to a huge shock to the Japanese public, so apparently after 46 years, a district court found there was reason to believe evidence against him had been falsified. Is this real life right now? Do we have another innocent guy who was on death row serving almost 50 years for something that he didn't do? Alright, number 5, we have Betty Smithy, who served 49 years in prison. Betty walked into prison with a life sentence for murder, and at the age of around 70 years old, she was walking out with a cane. Betty is America's longest serving female inmate. She was behind bars for the murder of a 15-month-old child by strangling the baby while she was babysitting. The court sentenced her to life without parole. After years went by, her sentence was lowered to just 48 years to life. Moving into number 4, we have Patrick Maloney, who just walked out of an Arizona prison after spending nearly 50 years in prison, and this is for killing his mother and his stepfather, and this is back in 1964. Patrick was released at the age of 65 years old, which means, if my calculations are right, he was 15 years old when he committed those horrible crimes. That is just something that doesn't sit well in my stomach. This is a teenager. For almost 50 years, Patrick has been fighting to be released from jail. He was first sentenced to life in prison, and then he had the death sentence, but then it was turned back again into a life sentence. Patrick started working with the attorney from Justice Project, and that was when he was granted hearings in a superior court. The US Supreme Court decided that having a life sentence without the possibility of parole for a juvenile murderer is just too cruel, and actually it's an unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. I think if you murder someone, no matter what age you are, I think you should just be sentenced away and forgotten about. But maybe I'm just too harsh. Number 3, we have John Hall, who is actually still in prison, but there is a law that is out now that outlawed an old law that might make him released. Well, let me explain. John has a great chance of getting out of jail very soon. John has been fighting for his life since he was 17 years old after he received a life sentence for his role in a back alley killing in Detroit that claimed the life of a 63-year-old man. The US Supreme Court outlawed mandatory life sentences for juveniles. A judge gave John a potential second chance at life by re-sentencing him to 40 to 60 years in prison. After having already served 50 years, he's only got like 10 more years to serve, so John Hall, he should be released pretty soon. So this guy totally outlived like a 50 to 60 year life sentence. Number 2, we have Earl Reinhardt, who is now set free after being in prison for 50 years. Earl was released when he was 75 years old. When he was released, he became homeless instantly because he has no money, he has no family members to help him out. Earl has been trying to keep warm in libraries, stories. He's been seen eating in soup kitchens. Earl actually ended up in a nursing home because he couldn't take care of himself. He just got too old. There was not a lot of information on this guy because it just seems like society has just forgotten about him. And this seems to be a common trend for this next one. Finally, number 1, we have Machal Lalung from India, who served 54 years in an Indian jail. Machal was arrested at the age of 23 years old back in 1951 in his home village. Machal was booked under section 326 of the Indian Penal Code for causing grievous harm, which means he inflicted harm on someone, maybe like a stab wound or something. The charge normally results in a sentence of no more than 10 years imprisonment. Well, here's where this story gets crazy. The civil rights organization who investigated the case later found no substantial evidence to support the charge. Less than a year after his arrest, he was transferred to a psychiatric institute in Tezpur, India. Doctors there certified Machal as fully fit, but instead of being released, he was for some reason transferred to a jail where he was just forgotten about. So Machal was forgotten about for 54 years. So for 54 years, for no reason at all, he was just sentenced away. He just had, like, I don't really understand this one. It's really sad if you ask me. I don't get how something like this goes on for over 50 years.